during the autumn of 1789, within a serene agricultural county nestled between the Blue Ridge and the Massanutten Mountains in Virginia's Shenandoah Valley. A 23-year-old woman by the name of Patience Reed was pronounced dead following a prolonged, debilitating illness. She was interred before sunset in a private family burial ground situated behind her father's orchard. The casket was fashioned from simple pine, and for the first 4 decades, her grave remained unmarked. The funeral was attended solely by the Reed household and their personal minister. The county coroner, who was related to her father through marriage, signed the death certificate without ever viewing the body. For 6 subsequent generations, her name appeared in no family Bible, no tax record, no church registry, no correspondence, and no last will and testament. Nevertheless, when restoration workers opened a sealed door behind the kitchen pantry in the old Reed farmhouse during the 1890s, they discovered words carved into the interior of the oak frame at approximately the height of a seated woman's shoulder. The inscription read, "I am still here. Please," alongside nearly 4,000 additional marks etched into the wood, apparently with a sewing needle. Before we delve further into Patience Reed's story and the actions of the Reed family of Augusta Hollow toward one of their own over 29 years, please take a moment to subscribe to this channel. Activate the notification bell to ensure you don't miss our next narrative, and let us know in the comments which state or city you're tuning in from at this moment. The voices of the past have a way of reaching ears willing to listen. To comprehend what transpired within that farmhouse, one must first understand the county. And to understand the county, one must grasp what it meant to be a Reed in the valley during the years immediately following the Revolution. Augusta Hollow was not its authentic name. The actual designation has been quietly expunged from regional records by descendants who still own land there, and local archivists tend to refer to the area by that older, unofficial name when they mention it at all. In 1785, it was a settlement of perhaps 400 souls dispersed across 30 miles of bottomland and low, wooded ridges, connected by wagon roads that transformed into red mud from October through April and choking dust from June through August. Winters descended harshly from the Alleghenies, bringing a cold that could freeze wet hair solid between the kitchen and the woodshed. Summers enveloped the hollow in a thick green steam, rising from the creeks that never fully lifted. A humidity that softened paper, rusted iron, and summoned mosquitoes in gray clouds every dusk. The inhabitants planted wheat, rye, and flax, raised hogs and a few dairy cattle, pressed cider each October, and ground grain at 2 mills situated at either end of the main creek. One of those mills belonged to the Reeds. The other, until 1783, had been owned by a family named Houchins. When the Houchins mill burned on a still August night, without explanation, the fire bright enough to be seen from the far ridge, and extinguished before the nearest neighbor could finish saddling a horse. And when the family moved west within 6 months, selling their land at a loss to Silas Reed himself, the Reed mill became the sole mill in the hollow. And Silas Reed, Patience's father, became the only miller. That represents a form of power difficult for people today to imagine. Every farmer in Augusta Hollow brought his grain to Silas Reed. Every loaf of bread in every cabin in the hollow had passed through Silas Reed's stones. He established the toll. He set the hours, and he remembered who paid cheerfully and who paid late. He preserved those memories in a small leather ledger he wore on a thong around his neck, inside his shirt, because he liked to say that a man's memory was the only book a thief could not steal. The Reeds had entered the valley 3 generations earlier, part of that great migration of Scots, Irish and English Presbyterian families who had traveled through the Great Wagon Road and settled the frontier when it was still wilderness, when the trees were still large enough to conceal a full-grown bear at noon, and the nearest magistrate was a 4-day ride to the east. By the time of the Revolution, the Reeds owned nearly 800 acres of the finest bottomland in the county. A handsome 2-story stone and timber house with a cedar shingle roof, the mill, a tannery whose smell the westerly wind carried for a quarter-mile, and partial interest in a store at the crossroads where travelers stopped for salt, nails, and tobacco. Silas Reed had served as a lieutenant in the county militia during the war, and he preferred to be addressed by that rank in formal settings long after the conflict ended. His elder brother Jonas Reed was a justice of the peace and sat on the county court, where his voice was quiet and his decisions final. Their first cousin, Ezekiel Reed Sen, was the circuit-riding minister who preached in 4 meeting houses across the valley, including the one in Augusta Hollow, a tall, thin man with a scholar's stoop who carried a worn Geneva Bible in a leather sack strapped across his chest. Their sister, Prudence, had married a physician named Alexander Gisham, who had studied briefly at the medical school in Edinburgh before returning to Virginia, and who served as the only doctor within a day's ride. A man with cold, clean hands and an unhurried manner, said by grateful mothers to be gentle with children, and by nervous men to be impossible to read. If you wanted your marriage blessed, your deed recorded, your grain ground, your cut stitched, or your soul saved, you went to a Reed, or to someone who had married into the Reeds. There was, people later, said nothing that happened in Augusta Hollow that a Reed did not eventually hear about, and nothing a Reed wanted kept quiet that did not stay quiet. Into this family, on a cold February morning in 1766, with ice still thick on the inside of the window glass, and a fire roaring in the birthing room hearth, Patience Reed was born. She was the third of Silas and Margaret Reed's 5 children. From the beginning, she was described by neighbors and cousins in the few surviving letters that mention her as the brightest child in the household. She read the King James Bible straight through before she was 10, first aloud to her mother while her mother spun wool, and then by lamplight alone, mouthing the words that troubled her, which her mother noticed were always the ones about obedience. She could reckon a ledger faster than her elder brother Caleb, and she did it without moving her lips, which Silas first took as a parlor trick, and then gradually as a thing that annoyed him. She could ride anything with 4 legs. She walked the 8 miles to the meeting house in any weather, and she once walked it in a spring thunderstorm with her shoes in her hand. Because, she said, shoes were not meant to be wept on by the sky. A cousin visiting from Winchester in 1782 wrote home that Patience Reed had the kind of mind that made a man forget she was a girl, and meant it as a compliment because he did not know how else to say it. She was 16 that year. She had her mother's hair, which was the brown of new, cut oak with reddish lights in it, and her father's eyes, which were a pale gray that in certain lights looked nearly colorless. She was, by the standards of the Hollow, tall for a woman, nearly 5'7", and she held herself straight because her mother had told her from the time she could walk that a Reed did not slouch. A year later, in the spring of 1783, at the age of 17, Patience Reed did something that the county would not forgive and that her family could not tolerate. She fell in love with a man her father had not chosen for her. His name was Thomas Trimble, and he was the son of a Quaker Wright who had settled on the western edge of the Hollow 3 years earlier. The Trimbles were peaceable, literate, and poor. A small family with a strong father, a quiet mother, and 3 sons who worked wood the way some men worked the violin. Thomas was the youngest. He was 19, He had black hair that curled at the temples, hands that had been calloused since he was 12, and a habit of listening before he spoke, so unusual in the hollow that older men sometimes mistook it for dullness until he answered them, which he always did precisely. In the eyes of Silas Reed, the Trimbles were three things at once that he could not abide. They were not Presbyterian. They did not believe in oaths, which meant they could not hold office, sit on juries, or swear to the truth of a deed, which to Silas meant they were not full participants in the life of the county, could not be trusted to support it, and had nothing whatsoever to offer. Patience had met Thomas at the Crossroads store in August of 1782, when she had gone in for a paper of pins, and he had been repairing a broken wagon wheel outside. She had stood in the doorway watching him work for what her younger sister later said was an embarrassingly long time. They began, in the way of young people in small communities, to find reasons to be in the same places. They met that autumn and winter. At the meeting house steps after service, at the store, at the mill, at the spring where everyone drew drinking water, and once the following spring, in the reed orchard, where Thomas had come with his father to deliver a repaired cart, and where Patience, seeing him, had walked out with a jug of cider, as if she had planned to do nothing else all day. They spoke, as far as anyone who saw them could tell, of ordinary things: the weather, the war that had just ended, the books Patience had read, the wood Thomas was working. But by the summer of 1783, they had an understanding between them that they had not spoken aloud, and that both treated as already binding. When Patience came to her father in July of that year, and told him plainly that she intended to marry Thomas Trimble, Silas Reed first laughed because he thought she was joking, and then, when he saw her face, went very quiet, and then very calmly forbade it. She went to her mother, who wept for half an hour without speaking, and then said, "Child, your father will not be moved," and refused to intervene. She went to her Uncle Jonas, the magistrate, who was sitting on the porch of his own house, and who listened to her all the way through, and then told her, without looking up from his pipe, that she was disgracing the family, and that he would not hear another word. She went to her cousin, the minister Ezekiel Kawan, who was the gentlest of them, and who told her with genuine sadness that obedience to a father was obedience to God, and that she was being asked to carry a cross no heavier than the one borne by many good women before her. And when, in early October of that year, on a morning so cold that the breath of the horses hung in the air like lamp smoke, Patience Reed walked out of her father's house, before dawn with a satchel under her cloak, and began walking the road toward the Trimble farm. Her elder brother Caleb and two hired men overtook her at the covered bridge. They had been sent because her father had woken in the night with a feeling, had gone to her room, and had found her bed empty and her best shoes gone. Caleb caught hold of her arm at the bridge. One of the hired men took her other arm. She did not fight because she was a Reed, and a Reed did not fight with witnesses. She walked back to the house between them. When they reached the porch, her father was waiting on the step with his face the color of wet ash. He did not strike her because he did not need to. He said only, "You will never embarrass this family again." She was taken upstairs to her room, and the door was locked. That is the last the Hollow saw of Patience Reed for 29 years. What the Hollow was told was this: Patience had taken ill during an autumn fever that did in fact pass through the valley in October of 1783, killing two elderly neighbors and a child. The fever, according to Dr. Gisham, had settled first in poor Patience's lungs, and then, over the following winter, in her mind. She had become, in the careful language of the time, nervous and unsound. By the spring of 1784, The Reeds were explaining to sympathetic neighbors. In the parlor over tea, at the meeting house after service, across the counter at the Crossroads store, that poor patients could no longer be shown to company, that she spoke strangely, that she had fits, that she did not know her own name some days. Dr. Gisham confirmed all of this in his rounds. He shook his head gravely when asked, and said that the mind was a delicate instrument, and that once the strings were cut, they could not always be restrung. The women of the hollow clucked their tongues, and repeated his phrase to their husbands at supper. The Reverend Kawan confirmed it from the pulpit one Sunday in May of 1784, asking the congregation to pray for the afflicted daughter of a good family, and to remember that the Lord sometimes laid his heaviest hand on those he most loved. Silas Reed told the community that his daughter would be cared for at home, as was the Christian duty of any family, and that visitors would not be received as the excitement disturbed her. Margaret Reed, it was said, rarely left the house after that spring, and neighbors who caught glimpses of her through the kitchen window said she had aged 10 years in one. For the next 29 years, the Reed family of Augusta Hollow lived in the largest and most respected house in the valley. For the first 7 or 8 years of that period, now and then a neighbor or a cousin would politely ask after patients and would be told with a gentle shake of the head that she was no better. After that, people stopped asking. Children grew up in the hollow who had never heard of Patience Reed at all. The household servants, who were hired from as far away as Staunton and were turned over with unusual frequency, were told she had died young, were shown the grave in the orchard plot, and were paid a little better than the going rate, and were given a stern warning upon hiring that the back of the house, beyond the pantry door, was not a part of their responsibility. The family story hardened into the kind of fact that no one thinks to question. A decade went by, and then 2. Silas Reed grew old. His hair went white and then thin. The mill passed to his son Caleb. Margaret Reed died in 1801 of a sudden stoppage of the heart, which was what they called a stroke in those days, and was buried in the churchyard with a handsome stone bearing a verse from Proverbs about the virtuous woman. The old Reed house settled into its grounds the way old stone houses do, its stones darkening with rain and lichen, its cedar roof weathering to the color of a dove's wing. In the long afternoons, the orchard behind it grew heavy with apples no one picked any more. Apples that fell in October and rotted where they lay, drawing wasps up in thick, droning clouds. And somewhere inside that house, for all of those years, something was happening that no one outside the family knew, and that only a handful of people inside the family knew in full. In 1812, in the early weeks of the war with Britain, Silas Reed, now 71 years old, fell down the back staircase of his own house on a wet March evening and broke his hip. He lingered for 11 days. On the first day, he cursed the stair. On the third day, he cursed the girl who had polished it. On the 5th day, he asked for his wife, who had been dead 11 years, and his son Caleb gently reminded him. On the 7th day of his lingering, with his mind already loosening, and the smell of the sick room turned to that sweet, heavy smell that old nurses knew, meant the end was near. He called for his brother Jonas and for the Reverend Kawan. In the presence of those 2 men and of his son Caleb, he gave, according to a letter later written by Ezekiel Kawan's grandson and preserved in a cedar chest in Roanoke, a confession of such a nature that the 3 men agreed before leaving the room that it would never be spoken of again outside the family, and that what Silas had done would be addressed by them privately with the tools available to them. Silas Reed died on the 11th day, a Wednesday, near dawn. According to Kawan, His last words were not a prayer. They were a question. He asked, "Will she forgive me?" And no one in the room answered him, because no one in the room knew. He was buried with full honors of the county. The militia turned out. The store closed for the day. Black creep hung from the meeting house door. A little over a month later, in early June of 1812, with the apples setting on the branches in the orchard, and the creek running clear between its banks, the Reverend Ezekiel Kawan, Caleb Reed, and Dr. Alexander Gisham walked together into a small windowless room at the back of the Reed farmhouse, behind a false wall that ran along the pantry, and brought out of that room a woman 46 years old who had not seen the sun, or any person outside her immediate family, or any room larger than 12 feet by 7 since she was 17. Hold that image for a moment because it matters. Think about the year she went in and the year she came out. When Patience Reed went behind that wall, George Washington was still alive and had not yet been inaugurated for a second term. The Bill of Rights had not yet been ratified. There were 13 states in the Union. The Constitution was 2 years old. When she came out, James Madison was president. Napoleon was a few weeks away from invading Russia. The steamboat had been invented. Cotton gins were spreading across the South, and her younger brother's younger son was about to be 18 years old. 29 years is a number you have to feel rather than count. It is longer than most marriages of the period lasted. It is longer than many lives of the period lasted. It is longer than the time between the Declaration of Independence and the Louisiana Purchase. It is longer than the entire lifespan of a man who dies of the things men died of in 1812. And during those 29 years, Patience Reed was not kept in a dungeon. She was not chained. She was not, by the cruel standards of what human beings have done to one another, starved or beaten. She was kept in a clean room with whitewashed walls, with a rope bed with a straw, tick mattress changed twice a year, a chamber pot that was emptied every morning before dawn, a washstand with a tin basin and a pitcher of water brought fresh daily, a single beeswax candle lit for 4 hours in the evening and then extinguished, a small iron stove for the coldest months fed through a hatch in the wall from the kitchen side, so she could not reach the fire, a wooden chair, and a small table. She was fed 3 times a day, simple food, mostly what the family ate, passed through the slot in the oak door on a wooden tray. She was allowed 1 book at a time from her father's library, cycled every fortnight, and she was given sewing work to do. Shirts and handkerchiefs, and the endless household mending of a farm with 5 children, and a dozen hired hands. And she was told that her work was being given to charity, which was, in a particular and cold sense, true. 2 afternoons a week, her mother would sit outside the door and read to her through a slot cut into the wood at the level of the latch. A narrow slit no wider than 3 fingers, closed from the outside by a small iron plate on a pivot that her father believed was mercy. If you are enjoying this story and want to help us keep bringing these forgotten histories out of the dark corners of the American past, take a second right now to leave a like on this video and drop a comment below. Tell us what you think of Silas Reed's idea of mercy. We read every single comment, and your words help these stories reach more people who love the slow, terrible truths of the past. Now the question that a reasonable person asks at this point is the obvious one. How does a family do this in a community of 400 people? In a house with servants for 29 years without a single neighbor, laborer, wagoner, or passing stranger ever catching a glimpse, hearing a voice, or noticing a discrepancy? The answer, reconstructed painfully from the papers that finally came out of the Reed farmhouse in the 1890s and from a cache of documents held by a Kawan descendant in Roanoke, is that it took 4 people and a precise, continuous act of social engineering that lasted almost 3 decades. The 4 people were Silas Reed himself, his wife Margaret, his brother Jonas the magistrate, and his brother-in-law Alexander Gisham the physician. The minister Ezekiel Kawan, according to the later Kawan letter, did not know the truth until the deathbed confession in 1812. Although he had, the writer observed with dry regret, perhaps suspected more than he said. The son Caleb Reed was brought into the knowledge in 1805 when he turned 30 and was required to take an oath on the family Bible never to speak of it. An oath that the writer noted Caleb kept for the rest of his life. The daughters were never told. The younger children, who had been too small in 1783 to understand where their sister had gone, grew up with the vague sense that Patience had died of the fever and that she was not a subject one raised in front of their father. The household servants were never told. The false wall had been built in the autumn of 1783 by a pair of journeymen carpenters, brought up from Lynchburg and paid handsomely to do a job in 3 days and leave. The job they were given was a very particular one. The small back room had been the household pantry. The carpenters were told the family wished to extend the pantry forward toward the kitchen and to use the original back wall space for storage of a different kind. The wall they built was plastered and whitewashed on the kitchen side. From the kitchen side, it looked exactly like the back wall of a pantry, with shelves built into it at the expected height. Behind those shelves, separated by a short interior corridor just wide enough for one person to pass, was the original oak door to what had been the pantry and was now Patience's room. That door was fitted with a new lock and with the narrow slot at latch height. The carpenters were told the arrangement was to protect valuables from household theft. They accepted this without question because they were paid enough not to ask. One of them died of drink in 1788, the other left for Kentucky in 1791 and was never heard from again. The records of their employment at the Reed farm do not survive. Dr. Gisham, whose name was on every piece of paper that anyone might have questioned, including the original fever diagnosis of October 1783, renewed the fiction of Patience's declining health, then of her seclusion, and then, in 1789, of her death, with a calm professional authority that no one in a rural Virginia county was going to challenge. He was, after all, the only man in the county who had studied in Edinburgh. He was, after all, her uncle. He loved her, people said. Jonas Reed, the magistrate, made certain that no guardianship petition, no inheritance question, no property filing ever required Patience Reed's presence, her signature, or her attestation. He simply settled all such matters as a matter of family discretion, which in a county where he was the court meant that they were settled. When Patience's share of a small inheritance from her maternal grandmother came due in 1792, Jonas handled it. When a distant cousin wrote in 1797 inquiring whether any young Reed daughters might be of an age for correspondence with her own son in Philadelphia, Jonas replied on his brother's behalf and explained with great delicacy the sad condition of the family. Silas and Margaret carried the daily weight. They carried the meals on a covered tray. They carried the chamber pot out in the dark. Margaret at first, and later. After Margaret could no longer face it, Silas himself, before the household was awake, crossing the kitchen in his stocking feet, so as not to wake the servants sleeping in the loft. They carried the lamp oil in. They carried the fresh water. They carried the books. For 29 years, every single day, without exception, one of them opened the small iron-hinged slot in the oak door, passed those things through, and closed the slot again. And here is the part that makes the story what it is. because it is not simply a story about cruelty. It is a story about what people tell themselves when they are doing something unforgivable. Silas Reed did not believe in his own mind that he was punishing his daughter. He believed he was protecting her. He believed, according to the long and grinding confession he gave on his deathbed, and which his son Caleb committed to paper that same week, that the fever of October 1783 had indeed taken something from Patience's mind, and that what it had taken was her capacity to choose wisely for herself, and that her desire to marry Thomas Trimble was the proof of this. A sound young woman of her station did not marry a Quaker Wright's son. Therefore, she was not sound. And a young woman who was not sound could not be released into the world without bringing ruin upon herself and shame upon the family that had failed to restrain her. He believed, with the terrible sincerity of a man who had built himself a theology out of his own convenience, that he was doing the Christian and the fatherly thing, and that he would answer for it to God, and that God would understand. He believed that asylums, which existed in that period, but only barely, and which he had heard described by travelers as places of chains, filth, and shame, were not a fit place for a Reed. He believed that the world outside the house would mock her, and through her, mock him. He believed that time, quiet, and prayer would bring her back to her senses. He also believed that Patience herself, over time, would come to understand. This last belief is the one that cracked his mind open in the end, and the one he confessed to his brother and to his minister in 1812, because by then even he had come to understand that she had not and would not, and that what she had been doing in that room for 29 years was not coming to understand at all. She had been keeping count. The 4,000 marks on the inside of the oak door frame, scored with the point of a sewing needle pulled from the hem of her own dress, were days. They were not all of the days. There were, in 29 years, 593 days, and she had marked perhaps 3/4 of them. Because in the early years, and in certain winter stretches, she had not always felt able to lift the needle. There were whole months, particularly in the third winter, when she lay on the straw tick with her face turned to the wall and counted nothing, because nothing in her was counting. There were other months, years later, when she carved 4 or 5 marks in a single hour to catch up with time, working quickly and precisely the way she had watched the Trimbles work wood, listening for her father's step in the kitchen above. In the middle years, she began to group the marks in patterns only she understood. Every 7th mark was a small cross rather than a line. Every 28th mark carried a tiny circle at its base for the moon. She had lost the track of her menses inside the first 3 years, a thing her mother had explained to her through the slot with great embarrassment when it happened. And so the moon was the only cycle left to her. On the clearest winter nights, she could feel its pull, the way a sailor feels the pull of a current, though she could not see it, and she marked it anyway, from memory of the sky she had last seen at the age of 17. She had other occupations, because a mind that is not occupied in a room that sighs will eat itself, and she had understood this by the 2nd year, and had set herself tasks the way a soldier in a besieged garrison sets himself tasks. She memorized the books her mother passed her. Not the stories, but the sentences, whole pages at a time. And she recited them to herself in the dark. When a book was returned to the library, she could still, a year later, call up its paragraphs, word for word. She made small cloth dolls from scraps of her own dress hems, and she gave each doll a name from a book she had read. When the dolls had been her companions for a while, she undid them carefully back into their threads and remade them as different dolls. She kept a map of the farmhouse in her head, drawn from what she had known of it as a child and corrected by the sounds she heard each day. The creak of the stair, the thump of the kitchen door, the voice of a cook she would never meet calling a child in from the yard. The bell of the mill 2 miles off across the bottomland carried on still mornings through the layers of plaster and oak and into her room. She knew, by the 5th year, the footsteps of every person who lived in the house and every person who regularly came into it. She knew them so well that once, when a strange man came to the kitchen to ask directions, and stood a moment by the pantry wall, she could tell from his step that he was lame in the left foot and carrying something heavy in his right hand. And she was right about both. She had started the count itself sometime in the 2nd or 3rd year of her confinement, because by then she had understood, in a way she had not at first, that her father was not going to change his mind, that her mother was not going to cross him, and that the quiet footsteps on the stair that she waited for every evening were never going to stop at her door with the sound of the lock being turned for the last time. At first, the Koan letter tells us, she screamed. She screamed for the first 11 days steadily, hoarsely, all day and into the night, until her voice gave out completely and was for a full month reduced to a whisper. She screamed off and on for the first 9 months, whenever the full weight of what was happening to her returned to her fresh, which in the early period was several times a day. The Reeds told the servant she was suffering from fits, and the servants were dismissed and replaced with servants hired further away, in Harrisonburg, in Staunton, in Winchester. Those servants were told on their first day that they were not to concern themselves with the sounds they might occasionally hear from the back of the house, which were the troubled sounds of an afflicted young woman whose condition was not to be discussed. Then, for a long time, she was silent, through the winter of 1784 and into the spring of 1785. She did not make a sound that anyone outside her door could hear, and Margaret would stand with her ear pressed to the oak for long minutes to be sure her daughter was still alive. Then, sometime around the summer of 1786, Patience began to sing through the slot in the door. Hymns at first, the ones she had learned at her mother's knee, sung slow and low and without apparent feeling, as if she were dragging each note out of herself by hand. Then older songs her Quaker boy had taught her in the orchard, songs about rivers and about traveling, sung in the same low voice. Then songs she seemed to be making up herself, long, circling songs with no clear melody and words her mother could not always follow. Songs about numbers and about the names of birds and about the shape of the window she could remember from her childhood room. Margaret would sit on the other side of the door for hours and weep, without a sound, so that Silas would not hear her from the kitchen. Patience asked in the first few years about Thomas Trimble. She asked in the first week, beating her fists against the oak and calling for him. She asked in the 2nd month through the slot calmly, as if she were asking about the weather. She asked in the 6th month, when she had begun to understand that she was not going to be let out. She asked for the last time, her mother later told Caleb, in the autumn of 1785, 2 years after she had been shut in. When she asked through the slot whether Thomas had looked for her, her mother told her he had come twice and had been turned away, had gone west, and had married someone else. This was a lie. Thomas Trimble had come to the Reed house twice in the autumn of 1783, asking to speak to her, and had been told she was too ill to see anyone, and had been told the 2nd time by Silas Reed himself on the front porch, with a loaded musket leaning again beside him, that if he came a 3rd time, he would not leave the property. Thomas Trimble left the valley in the spring of 1784. He went south and west into the Carolina back country. He did eventually marry a woman named Abigail Fenwick, a Methodist cooper's daughter. He did have children, 4 of them. He did live a long life, dying in 1841 at the age of 77. But he wrote in a letter to his eldest son in 1822, preserved and examined, that he had thought of a certain Virginia girl every day of his life, and that he had always believed something had been done to her, that he had not been allowed to see, and that he had failed her by not coming back. He never came back. That was the second quiet horror of Patience Reed's life. The boy she had tried to run to had been turned away at the door, had gone away, had grown old, and had mourned her without ever knowing that she was 100 yards from where he had stood that second time, behind a false wall, listening. Though what she had heard of his voice on that second visit, muffled by plaster and oak, and the length of the corridor, had been for her, she later said, the last clear sound of the outside world. She had made her mother describe it to her afterward, again and again, year after year, until her mother's descriptions themselves became the sound, and the original voice beneath them was lost. After her mother Margaret died in 1801, the only remaining daily contact was with her father. Silas Reed, now in his 60s, continued to bring her meals himself, rather than entrusting the task to anyone else. He sometimes, according to the confession, tried to speak to her through the slot. He would ask if she was warm enough. He would ask if she wanted another book. He would ask if she had forgiven him yet. She did not answer him in words. Not after 1801. She answered him, when she answered him at all, by scratching the needle against the wood in the place where he could hear it. 3 short scrapes, meaning no. Year after year, no, no, no. And each year, on a date that corresponded precisely to the day, in October 1783, on which Caleb had brought her home from the covered bridge, she scored a longer mark into the door. A mark that cut all the way through the outer grain of the oak. A mark she made, Gisham later wrote, with what must have been very deliberate pressure and a steady hand, and which, on the last count, when the door was opened in 1812, numbered 29. She had been counting her imprisonment the way a prisoner of war counts it, because that is what she had become. She was not a sick woman being cared for. She was a prisoner of her family. Somewhere between the 10th year and the 15th year, according to a notation in Dr. Gisham's private case book discovered in the 1890s, she had stopped being a young woman who was being broken, and had become a middle-aged woman who had been broken, and had reassembled herself out of the pieces into something harder and more watchful than her father had ever imagined she could become. Gisham wrote, in a line he would surely have burned, if he had thought anyone would ever read it, that he had looked through the slot in the door in the spring of 1798, and had met her eye, and had been unable to eat for 3 days afterward. He wrote further in the same entry that she had not spoken to him, but that she had raised one finger, and had, with that finger drawn slowly in the air the shape of the door between them, and had then touched her own chest, and had then pointed at him. He understood the sentence perfectly. You built this. I am still here. It is between us. He closed the slot, walked out of the house, and did not return to see her for 7 months. When he finally did return, it was Silas who had demanded it, and he had looked at the floor the whole time. Just when we thought we'd seen it all, the horror in Augusta Hollow intensifies. If this story is giving you chills, share this video with a friend who loves dark mysteries. Hit that like button to support our content, and don't forget to subscribe to never miss stories like this. Let's discover together what happened next. In early June of 1812, A month after Silas Reed's funeral, the three men walked into that back room. The weather had turned warm, and the windows of the farmhouse were open. From the orchard came the smell of cut grass and the sound of a child, one of Caleb's daughters, calling for a lost kitten. The oak door had a lock on the outside that had been replaced 3 times over the decades as the mechanism wore out, and the key had hung from a nail behind the kitchen dresser since 1801, when Margaret died and Silas had moved it to a place he could reach without explanation. Caleb Reed took it down. His hand was shaking so badly that the key knocked twice against the dresser before he could close his fingers around it. Doctorate. Jisham carried a lamp. Although the afternoon light coming through the open kitchen door made it unnecessary, and he carried it, Kawan later wrote, the way a man carries a shield. The Reverend Kawan carried a Bible, which was the only thing he had thought to bring, and which he later wrote felt absurdly light in his hands as he walked down the corridor, as if it had been hollowed out. They passed the shelves of the pantry. They passed into the short interior corridor. They stood before the oak door. Caleb put the key in the lock. The lock turned. The sound of the mechanism, Kawan wrote, was the loudest sound he had ever heard in a house. They opened the door. What came out of that room, according to the account set down 5 days later by Ezekiel Kawan in a letter to his son, that was not meant to be read for 100 years and was not read for 112, was not the pale, broken, pitiable creature they had prepared themselves to receive. Patience Reed was 46 years old. She was very thin but not wasted, because she had been fed, and she had, in her small room, walked in small circles for hours every day to keep herself moving. A habit she had begun, she later said, in the 2nd year, when she had realized her legs were beginning to go numb, and that her father would not unlock the door for that or for anything. Her hair had turned the color of ash, although it still held the shape of the braid. She put it in every morning. Her skin was the color of the inside of an eggshell, because she had not seen direct sunlight since the day she was 17. When Jisham held the lamp up and the light fell across her cheek, she winced and turned her face a little, not from pain, but from unfamiliarity. Her eyes, the minister wrote, had the shape and color of her eyes when she was a girl, but they had been made into something else by the work of the intervening years. When she looked at the 3 men, she looked at each of them in turn as if she were doing arithmetic. She did not cry. She did not faint. She did not reach for them. She was wearing a clean dress that had been passed through to her the week before, one of her mother's old dresses that had been let out at the seams by her own hands. And she had, sometime in the last hour, tied a thin black ribbon around her neck, which she had kept since 1783 in her small chest of possessions, and which none of them recognized. She walked slowly but steadily past the 3 of them, down the corridor, into the kitchen, and stopped in front of the kitchen window. She looked at the back orchard, where the apples were just beginning to set on the branches, and stood there without moving for the amount of time Kawan estimated it would take a man to read the Sermon on the Mount aloud. She did not weep. She watched the wind move the leaves. She watched a jay come down out of the apple tree and take a piece of bread crust from the kitchen step, and she made a small sound in her throat, a soft, broken laugh, as if she had not expected that a bird would still do that. Then she turned and looked at Caleb, her younger brother, who was now a man of 37 with a wife and 3 children of his own, whom she had never seen, and she said, in a voice that the minister described as terribly ordinary, a voice used to speaking softly through a slot in a door, I want to go outside now, please. They took her outside. The back step was of worn sandstone, and when her bare foot, because she had refused shoes, came down on the sun-warmed stone, she stopped and stood on it for a long moment. Kawan wrote that he had seen soldiers returned from a year in British prison hulks who had done exactly that thing with their feet on the first warm step of their own houses. And he had not known until that moment that his cousin had been a prisoner of the same kind, in a smaller war that no one had declared. They sat her on a bench in the orchard. Jisham, who was shaking, examined her briefly and told her she was in good enough health, which was, under the circumstances, a medically accurate and morally grotesque sentence. The minister began to attempt a speech about forgiveness, about her father's deathbed state, and about the mercy of God. She listened to him all the way through without interrupting, her face turned slightly toward the sun. Then she said, "I would like to speak with Thomas Trimble." They told her Thomas Trimble had left the valley 28 years before. They told her they did not know where he was. She accepted this without any visible reaction, which terrified them worse than any cry would have. Then she asked for pen and paper. Caleb brought them, along with a small writing desk from the parlor. She sat on the orchard bench with the desk on her lap. In the presence of the three men, Patience Reed wrote, in a hand that was slightly cramped from years of sewing and from scratching marks into oak with a needle, but perfectly legible, a single sheet of paper that laid out, in numbered paragraphs, the following requests: 1. That her continued existence be acknowledged quietly to the extended family, but not announced to the county, and that she be permitted to live out her remaining years without the attention of strangers, as she had had enough of walls and did not wish now to live inside the staring of a community. 2. That a portion of her father's estate corresponding to her share be set aside in her name and administered by her brother Caleb for her benefit. 3. That a sum of money be sent discreetly, by any means the family could manage, to Thomas Trimble, wherever he might now be found, with a letter of her composition, which she would write when she was able, explaining what had happened to her and releasing him from any guilt. 4. That no charge be brought against anyone, living or dead, for what had been done to her, because she had seen enough of her father's kind of justice for one lifetime, and she did not wish to begin her freedom by repeating him. 5. That the small back room, the room with the oak door and the slot and the marks on the frame, be left exactly as it was, and that the false wall not be taken down, because she wished, she wrote, for there to remain in the house a place that told the truth about what had happened in it, and that someone someday might find and read and understand. She signed the sheet, Patience Reed, and beneath her signature she wrote the date. Beneath the date she wrote, in smaller letters, "Still here." The three men signed the paper as witnesses. They honored the first 4 requests to the best of their ability, and imperfectly. The 4th request cost Caleb Reed more than he had expected. 3 weeks after his sister's release, he rode out to the grave of his father and stood over it for the better part of an afternoon. When he came back to the house that evening, he locked himself in his office and did not come out until morning. His wife said afterward that she had heard through the door a sound she had never heard her husband make in her life, and that she had not asked him about it then, and had not asked him about it since. Dr. Jisham lived for another 6 years after Patience's release. He saw her in his professional capacity exactly twice in that time, both times at her specific request, and both times in the presence of his wife. At the second of those visits, in the autumn of 1815, she asked him a single question which, according to his case book, he was unable to answer, and which he wrote down, placed in an envelope, and sealed, and which was found in his papers after his death in 1818. The question was, did you ever, in those years, come close to opening the door? The Reverend Kawan lived until 1827. He preached every Sunday for the rest of his life, and the people of his congregation noted that after the summer of 1812, his sermons changed. They had been, before that, careful expositions of doctrine. After that, they were about mercy, which he defined in a sermon his son later copied out and preserved as, "The act of unlocking a door one has had the power to unlock for a long time and has not." Patience Reed lived for another 19 years in the Reed farmhouse. In an upstairs room on the east side that had been her mother's sewing room, with a window that faced the orchard, and beyond it the blue line of the Massanutten. She took her meals with the family quietly, eating slowly because her stomach had shrunk, eating foods her sister-in-law prepared with particular attention, because for the first months she could not tolerate salt, or fat, or vinegar, or strong tea. She walked in the orchard every morning in any weather for exactly 1 hour. The length of time she had walked in her small room every day for 29 years. And her family learned not to interrupt her during that hour, because the one time Caleb had tried to join her, she had turned and looked at him, and he had, without her saying a word, understood and gone back inside. She read every book her late father had owned, which she had already read once during her imprisonment. And then she read them again. And she told Caleb, the first winter, that she had decided the books read differently on the outside of the door. She learned, with Caleb's wife's help, the names of all the children in the house. Within a year, the youngest of them, a girl of 5 named Eliza, sat on her lap by the fire every evening and asked her to tell stories, which Patience did, although the stories she told were, by Caleb's wife's account, not exactly like any other stories and contained long, strange pauses in them, and made the child thoughtful rather than sleepy. She never married. She never traveled farther than the county seat, because she said, a woman who had spent her youth in a room the size of a horse's stall did not find the world improved by being hurried through it. She took an interest in the Reed family ledgers, and Caleb, who had inherited the business, let her look at them. She found, in 3 separate years, small errors that the clerks had missed, and after that the clerks quietly brought the books to her first. She did charitable work through the church, though she would not attend services for the first 4 years after her release. When she finally did attend, she sat at the back and left before the final hymn. She visited her mother's grave every Sunday in the churchyard. She did not visit her father's grave at all, not once in the 19 years she had left. When she died, her family found in the small writing desk in her upstairs room a folded paper on which she had written, in her careful hand, "I have nothing to say to him." The letter to Thomas Trimble was written. It took her 3 months to write it, and she threw away 6 versions. The final one, according to Caleb, was shorter than any of the drafts. It was sent, and it was received in North Carolina in the late autumn of 1812 by a man who, when he opened it, according to his son's much later account, sat down at his kitchen table and read it twice, then went out to his barn and did not come back inside until the following morning. His wife Abigail, when he finally came in, did not ask him what was in the letter, because she had understood from the first year of their marriage that he had left something in Virginia, and she had made her peace with the shape of that absence. And she did not wish, after 28 good years, to put her hand on it and feel its edges. He wrote a reply. The reply reached Augusta Hollow in the spring of 1813. What it said has not survived, because Patience Reed burned it in the kitchen fire, after she had read it. She burned every letter he sent her over the following 28 years, of which there were, according to the household accounts, at least 52, one per year on the date of her original captivity. She kept one thing, the letter he had sent her in 1827, which contained a pressed wildflower from a field outside his home in Carolina, a small blue flower with 5 petals that Caleb's wife thought was a kind of wild chicory, and that Patience, who knew the wildflowers of her own valley, but not of his, could not name. She preserved it between the pages of her father's Bible, on the same page where the genealogy of the Reed family was written in Silas Reed's own handwriting, directly beneath the line where her father had recorded her death in October 1789. She placed the flower carefully on that line, closed the Bible, and did not open it again. She died in the spring of 1831 peacefully, at the end of a warm afternoon in May, of what Dr. Gisham's son, who had inherited the practice from his father, recorded as old age, although she was only 64, and although anyone who had seen her in the last year said she had aged very slowly after her release, as if time had paused in her and then resumed at half speed. Her brother's youngest child, Eliza, now a married woman of 24, wrote in a letter of that week that she had been sitting in her usual chair by the east window in the late afternoon, with her hands folded in her lap and the sunlight falling across her, and had seemed to the family to have fallen asleep. When Eliza came in to wake her for supper, she found that she had simply stopped. She was buried next to her mother in the churchyard, with a proper stone under the name Patience Reed, with the correct date of her birth and the correct date of her death, and beneath those dates, at her written request, the words, "She came home." The fictitious 1789 stone in the private plot was, at her further request, left standing, because she had said it was also a true stone in its way. It marked the death of a certain young woman who had intended to marry Thomas Trimble, and that young woman had in fact died in October of 1783 at the covered bridge when her brother Caleb had caught hold of her arm. The false wall came down in 1894 when a great-great-granddaughter of Silas Reed, a woman named Lavinia Reed Bollinger, who had inherited the farmhouse and was restoring it after a small kitchen fire that had damaged the plaster, ordered her workmen to open the pantry back to its original depth. The men, 2 brothers from the next county who knew the family only as old and respected, tore out the wall expecting to find nothing more than rot and old mouse nests, and instead found the preserved room behind it, the oak door still hung on its iron hinges. The latch still worked, the slot still open, the bed and washstand and chamber pot still in place under a coat of 82 years of dust, the small table with a half-finished piece of sewing on it, the chair pushed back as if the woman who had been sitting in it had stood up a moment ago and would be back. The workman called for Lavinia, who came into the kitchen, stood in the pantry doorway, looked through the opening, and then, without speaking, stepped through. She was in the room for nearly an hour. When she came out, she paid the workmen their full week's wages and sent them home with a request to speak of what they had seen to no one. A request they honored, as far as can be told, for the rest of their lives. Then she went and got every letter, every ledger, every account book, every Bible notation, and every physician's case book the family still possessed, which filled 3 trunks, and put them all together. Over the following 2 years, with the help of her brother Ephraim, a Presbyterian minister in Lexington, she reconstructed the whole account. She wrote to Thomas Trimble's descendants in North Carolina, whom she located through an elderly Methodist minister there, and received from them a copy of the only letter Patience had ever written to him that had been preserved. She published in 1897 a small privately printed volume titled A Daughter of Augusta Hollow, of which fewer than 100 copies were made, and of which perhaps 20 are known to survive in university special collections today. Most of what we know about Patience Reed comes from that volume, from the Kowan correspondence in Roanoke, from Gisham's case book, and from the door itself, which is still there in the farmhouse, which is still standing, which is still, by a thread of inheritance, in the hands of descendants of Silas Reed, who keep the room exactly as it was because Patience asked them to, and who allow scholars to see it by written request perhaps once or twice a decade, and who close the door again afterward, lock it, and hang the key back on the same nail behind the same dresser, not because they fear what is inside, but because they do not, and because they understand, as Lavinia came to understand, that a locked door is a different thing. When the person who is kept behind it has asked for it to stay that way. This mystery shows us that the most terrible things human beings do to one another are almost never done by monsters. They are done by fathers who believe they are loving their children, by brothers who believe they are protecting family honor, by doctors who believe they are serving medicine, by ministers who believe they are serving God, and by whole communities that believe it is impolite to ask. Silas Reed was a pillar of his county. He was buried with honors. His name is still on a creek and on a road in the valley. And behind the pantry of his beautiful stone house, in a clean, dry, well-lit room no bigger than a horse's stall, he kept his daughter for 29 years because she had tried to choose her own life, and because he loved her in the way that men of a certain kind say they love the things they cage. What do you think of this story? Do you believe everything was revealed? Do you think there are more rooms like Patience's in other houses, in other hollows, behind other pantries, in the histories of other respected families that no one has yet opened? Leave your comment below. If you enjoyed this tale and want more horror stories like this, subscribe, hit the notification bell, and share with someone who loves mysteries. See you in the next video.